When we think of Paris today, we imagine the city of light. Wide avenues, elegant cafes, the Eiffel Tower glowing, and an air of romance. But if you traveled back in time to Paris in 1750, the shock would be brutal. Forget the light. Forget the space. Paris, under the Ancien Regime, was a suffocating medieval city, about to explode inside its own walls. You are standing at one of the city gates. The first thing that hits you is not beauty, it is the smell. Travelers of the time described the odor of Paris as something physical, a soup in the air. There was no sewer system. The contents of chamber pots from 600,000 people were thrown into the streets every day, with only a shout of "Gare à l'eau," watch out for the water. Look at the ground. You are not stepping on asphalt or clean stone. You are stepping on the legendary Boue de Paris, the mud of Paris. A black, viscous, permanent mixture of dirt, trash, excrement and slaughterhouse waste that coated boots and stained the hems of dresses. The streets are narrow, twisting labyrinths with no sidewalks. Tall buildings of wood and plaster lean inward over the street, blocking the sun and creating a tunnel of perpetual shadow. There are no house numbers. You navigate by iron signs swinging in the wind, the fishing cat, the golden shield. It is a noisy, chaotic and dangerous place where noblemen's carriages run down pedestrians without stopping and where human life is worth very little. At the center of this chaos runs the vital artery of the city, the River Seine. Today, the banks of the Seine are romantic tourist promenades. In 1700, they were industrial zones of survival. Step closer to the water. The color is brown and oily. This is where washerwomen scrub the city's clothes, beating the fabric against stones. This is where tanneries wash hides with chemical agents. And this is where butchers dump animal blood. And tragically, it is from this same water that the porteurs d'eau, the water carriers, fill their buckets to sell door to door for the population to drink. Paris's water was a slow poison. Now, look at the bridges. Unlike today, many bridges in Paris, such as the Pont au Change, were not just crossings. They were streets, suspended over the water. Imagine a bridge lined with 3- or 4-story houses on both sides. You cross the river through a dark tunnel of goldsmith shops and money changers, without even being able to see the water below. These houses were deadly traps. Excessive weight and flooding of the Seine frequently caused entire bridges to collapse, dragging dozens of families and shops to the bottom of the river in the middle of the night. The only modern exception is the Pont Neuf, the new bridge. There are no houses there. It is the only place where Parisians can see open sky and the river. It is the social heart of the city, full of charlatans selling miracle cures, dentists pulling teeth on the sidewalk, prostitutes and pickpockets. It is the theater of urban life in its rawest form. In the middle of the Ile de la Cité rises Notre Cathedral. But it is not the clean, isolated monument you see in today's photos. In 1700, the cathedral is suffocating. There is no large open square in front of it. Shacks, taverns and shops cling to the church walls like barnacles on a ship. The entrance steps are used by beggars and sellers of fake relics. The cathedral itself looks old and weary. The statues of kings on the facade have been damaged by time, and the stone is blackened by soot from the city's fireplaces. Just a few blocks away lies the belly of Paris, the market of Les Halles. If the smell in the streets was bad, here it is unbearable. Mountains of rotting cabbages, fish that traveled for days without ice, and meat exposed to the open air. It is a sea of people shouting, bargaining and stealing. 18th century Paris is a city of violent contrasts. Beside a sacred church, you find a brothel. Beside the food market, you find the Cimetière des Innocents, the cemetery of the innocents. This cemetery was so overcrowded with bodies accumulated over centuries that the ground level rose 2 meters above the street. On rainy days, bones and fluids seeped through the walls of neighboring cellars, contaminating food and wine. Death and life in Paris were not neighbors. They slept in the same bed. While the people of Paris lived in mud, about 20 kilometers away, there existed another planet. Let us leave the filthy city behind and travel to the seat of absolute power, the Palace of Versailles. Here, everything is geometry, gold, and control. Louis XV and later Louis XV lived surrounded by the nobility in a gilded cage, deliberately cut off from the foul reality of the capital. The sight is dazzling. Halls of mirrors reflecting the light of thousands of candles, silks imported from China, gardens that seem designed by gods. The clothing is excessive. Men and women wear powdered white wigs, high-heeled shoes, and heavy makeup to hide the marks of smallpox. But do not be fooled by the perfume. Versailles also had its filthy side. The palace was built without adequate toilets for the thousands of people who lived there. In the gilded corridors, behind velvet curtains, nobles relieved themselves. The smell of urine and old sweat soaked into the galleries, masked only by heavy layers of perfume and flowers. Etiquette was rigid, but hygiene was medieval. Baths were rare, considered dangerous to health. This court lived in a bubble of pleasure and intrigue, spending tax money on parties and wars, while in Paris, the price of bread rose to levels that made hunger a daily companion. They did not know, or did not want to see, that they were dancing on a powder keg. Back in Paris, in the eastern part of the city, a stone structure dominated the skyline and the minds of its citizens, the Bastille. A massive medieval fortress with 8 round towers surrounded by a deep moat. Originally built to defend the city, by the 18th century it served a far more sinister purpose. It was the prison of the state. It represented the arbitrary power of the king. With a single piece of paper signed by the monarch called a lettre de cachet, anyone, from a noble writer like Voltaire to a simple merchant who spoke too freely, could be imprisoned there, without trial, without a release date. The legends surrounding the Bastille were terrifying. Stories were told of underground dungeons where water seeped down the walls, of prisoners chained in darkness for decades, forgotten by the world, known only as the man in the iron mask. Although in reality the prison was nearly empty and even comfortable for some nobles, for the people of Paris, it was the physical symbol of everything that was wrong. It was the shadow of the king hanging over their heads. The silhouette of the Bastille's towers, visible from poor working-class districts like the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, was a daily reminder: obey or disappear. But fear was slowly turning into anger. In July of 1789, the tension finally broke. Hunger, taxes, and anger at the luxury of Versailles drove the people into the streets. And they did not go to Versailles first. They went to the symbol of oppression at home. They marched on the Bastille, not to free prisoners, there were only 7 inside, but to seize the gunpowder stored in its basement. The fall of the fortress marked the end of an era and the beginning of the modern world. What happened next is symbolic. The Bastille was not merely taken, it was dismantled. The people used pickaxes and their bare hands to demolish the fortress, stone by stone, until nothing remained. Some stones were sold as souvenirs, others were used to build bridges. They literally walked over the ruins of their former prison. The Paris we see today, with its wide avenues, uniform buildings and parks, was born much later in the 19th century under the orders of Baron Haussmann, who destroyed the filthy medieval city to create the modern metropolis. He brought light, air and sewers. But if you walk the streets of Paris today, close your eyes for a second. Try to ignore the noise of cars and feel the past. Beneath the asphalt, the bones of that ancient, cramped, visceral city still exist. This was the reconstruction of 18th century Paris. If you enjoyed traveling through streets of mud and halls of gold, subscribe to the channel for the next historical journey. History is dirty, but we are here to clean it. Until next time.